Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Thursday, the 6th of November. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, markets expect the Bank of England to hold interest rates steady as British businesses warn the Chancellor Rachel Reeves against death by 1,000 taxes.
Donald Trump's global tariffs face a barrage of sceptical questions from the US Supreme Court.
Plus, reassessing the business climate. In an exclusive interview, the EU's Economy Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis tells us the bloc is listening to international concerns over its ESG rules.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The Bank of England is likely to keep interest rates unchanged today in what's expected to be a closely contested decision. Markets and economists expect the UK Central Bank to hold its benchmark rate at 4%, with a 6-3 split on the Monetary Policy Committee, the most common response in Bloomberg's survey. That would slow the once-a-quarter pace of cuts it has maintained since August 2024. Here's our chief UK economist, Dan Hansen.
I don't think they will cut, but I think it's going to be a tight decision between a cut and a hold. I think the bank will want to know what exactly is in the budget, and they don't know that yet. They can assume, as we've all been assuming for the past, coming on for 6 months now, what may or may not be in the budget. And they can obviously make assumptions, but they'll want to know. I also think, bigger picture, inflation's nearly 4%. It's quite a difficult backdrop for them to cut interest rates. It doesn't feel like there's any need to rush.
Dan Hansen from Bloomberg Economics there, as the BOE today also rolls out a new look monetary policy report and minutes that for the first time will show each of the 9 MPC policymakers setting out their views individually. We'll have the decision live here on Bloomberg Radio at 12 p.m. in London, followed by special coverage of the press conference led by Governor Andrew Bailey half an hour later.
Well, the UK's biggest business lobby is warning against tax hikes in the upcoming budget. Instead, the group is calling for measures including improving skills and developing new technology. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the story.
Death by 1,000 taxes. That's the fate which could await UK companies if the Chancellor hikes smaller levies, according to the Confederation of British Industry. CBI proposals to boost growth include fast-tracking infrastructure projects, lowering energy costs and promoting exports. The caution comes after Rachel Reeves set the stage for tax hikes in a pre-budget speech this week as she seeks to plug the fiscal hole. Lower productivity estimates from the Office for Budget Responsibility could mean a £20 billion hit to the government after the body was too optimistic about the economy in recent years. The situation could leave the Treasury needing to find as much as £35 billion just to restore the slim headroom they had last budget. But despite the downgrade, reports in the Financial Times say the Chancellor will spare British banks from bigger tax bills, making clear she wants the sector to remain competitive. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
The US Supreme Court appeared sceptical of President Trump's signature global tariff regime as justices questioned the use of an emergency powers law to collect tens of billions of dollars a month. The court hinted it was ready to put significant limits on tariffs for the first time since Trump took office in January. Hours after the hearing, the president gave his reaction on Fox News.
I heard the court case went well today, but I just heard that a little while ago because, as you know, it was just 2 hours ago that they finished up. But I will say this, it would be devastating for our country if we lost that. Devastating.
President Trump speaking there on Fox News' special report with Brett Baier. Now, ruling isn't expected for several weeks, but a decision against Trump could force refunds and remove a major burden on US importers, blunting the effect of tariffs as a tool against trading partners.
Well, President Trump is hosting a summit with 5 Central Asian countries as Washington steps up its push for influence in the mineral-rich region, where China and Russia have long held sway. It comes as the EU's Economy Commissioner has told Bloomberg Radio the bloc is now offering technology and financing to other countries to develop sources of those key minerals. Valdis Dombrovskis says that China's 12-month suspension of rare earth export curbs buys time, but it doesn't resolve the issue.
In a sense, it addresses short-term concerns, but it also shows vulnerability which we are facing in terms of these supplies, and therefore we also must work towards diversification of those supplies.
European Economy Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis. He went on to also signal that the EU is willing to accommodate international concerns about its ESG rules as the bloc fields threats from the US and Qatar.
Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang has warned that Beijing is currently on track to take the lead in artificial intelligence. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts has more.
China is going to win the AI race. Those are the stark words of the boss of the world's most valuable company. Speaking to the Financial Times, Nvidia's Jensen Huang says that the West, including the US and UK, was being held back by what he called cynicism. He says that lower energy costs and looser regulations are adding to Beijing's advantages. Huang's remarks come after the Trump administration maintained its ban on Nvidia selling its most advanced chips to China following the Trump-Xi summit last week. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, the US plans to cut domestic flight capacity by 10% at 40 major airports across the country if the government shutdown continues. The Federal Aviation Administration made the decision to ease pressure on air traffic controllers who have been reporting staff shortages and issues with fatigue. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy says the situation is fluid, but safety is the priority.
I anticipate there will be additional disruptions. There will be frustration. We are working with the airlines. They're going to work with passengers. But in the end, our sole role is to make sure that we keep this airspace as safe as possible.
Duffy added that any further restrictions on flights will be determined by data. The FAA said that flight reductions are expected to be staggered heading into the weekend and international routes won't be affected.
Those are your top stories. On the markets, we are seeing somewhat of a rebound in Asian stocks today. Dip buyers stepping in. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index up by 1.1%. The Nikkei in Tokyo 1.4% higher. The Hang Seng's up by 1.7%. European stock futures pretty flat at the moment. On Wall Street, they're slightly lower, 0.2 lower for Nasdaq futures after we saw that index rebound by 0.7% yesterday. Elsewhere in markets, we're also keeping an eye on gold prices up 0.2 at $3,986 a troy ounce.
Well, in a moment, we'll look ahead to the Bank of England's rate decision and analyse what emerged from the US Supreme Court hearing over Donald Trump's tariffs. Plus, we're also going to bring you the special interview that Stephen has done with the EU Economy Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, who's been speaking to us about Ukraine, trade with China and the pressure on the EU to water down its climate rules. Stephen, I saw some nice photographs of you sitting next to Valdis Dombrovskis in the Brussels studio. You're getting to know the commissioners now.
Yeah, I'm just making my way around. I have to meet them all eventually. It's a lot of handshaking to do, and you've got 27 of them to meet, Caroline as well. But before we get into those stories as well, I wanted to mention another story that we've been reading this morning for perhaps, you're looking to make a new investment, and why not buy a sports team, or at least part of one. This is something our colleague Ben Stopples has been reporting on. He covers the ultra rich, and he says that super rich clients at JP Morgan are now being increasingly attracted to invest in teams because they see it as something that can provide them with decent returns. It's not just a passion project anymore. According to their figures, 20% of 111 billionaire families that were surveyed by them now own controlling stakes in sports teams. That's up from 6% 3 years ago as well. So an increasing number of interests. Institutional investors are also getting in on this as well.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I mean, just look at in the UK, people like Jim Ratcliffe are taking that controlling stake in Manchester United only last year. I mean, that was $1.5 billion worth to buy about, it's a team that has struggled somewhat. But no, I think it's very interesting that, forget art or, cars or wine maybe. Now it's all about the sports team.
I feel like this is real life Ted Lasso is happening in front of us. So
Yes.
I'm familiar with the TV series anyway. Let's turn to the Bank of England decision today now. Expected to hold interest rates steady. Policymakers likely to be cautious given the budget looming in 3 weeks' time, despite assurances from the Chancellor that she won't add to inflation. Our UK correspondent Lizzie Burden is with us for more this morning. Lizzie, set us up then for today's decision.
Well, Stephen, as you say, the expectation is that they're going to hold rates at 4%, and that would break with the quarterly cadence of rate cuts that they've been in since last August, and it would break with the Fed. But do be on alert for a surprise cut today. It's what Nomura, Barclays and Goldman Sachs all see. And even if they do hold rates, it could be a really tight vote split. It could hinge on the governor, even if most economists see a 6-3 split. Why is it going to be so tight? Well, they're inching towards neutral rates, the rate that neither constrains nor stimulates the economy. And we just don't know where that is. Most economists think it's 3%, but as we get closer and closer, the more carefully and slowly the Monetary Policy Committee is likely to want to move. The other elephant in the room here, of course, is the budget on November the 26th. And yes, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, promised this week that it's going to be disinflationary, but I doubt that the Monetary Policy Committee is going to want to vote as if it will be. They'll want to see the policies for themselves. And indeed, it means that the updated forecasts today are somewhat moot. The expectation is that the inflation outlook is going to be downgraded for this year and next compared to the August projection, and that the growth and unemployment outlooks are going to stay the same. But we need to take that with a pinch of salt, given we don't know what's in the budget yet. But I'm really interested to hear what the governor has to say about the Chancellor and her budget, given, remember, on Tuesday, she had some shots to fire at the BOE for having rates at 4%. She says it's constraining business borrowing. Some have said that's a bit Trump-esque, so I wonder what Andrew Bailey has to say about that.
Yeah, so what will the press conference be focused on?
Well, we want to know when the next cut is coming if it isn't today. How long will this pause be? Is it next cut coming in December? And for clues about that, I'm really interested how the governor characterises that latest inflation reading, 3.8%. It's less than the Bank of England had forecast. It's less than consensus forecast was, but it's still nearly twice the BOE's target. How do they talk about the labour market? The last time they had a meeting, there were lots of warnings, hawkish hints about food price inflation, inflation expectations. If the communications today, Caroline, are very dovish, or indeed if they cut, we could see this continued outperformance for gilts that we saw all through October, and $1.30 really is the key level for the pound that we need to watch.
Lizzie, you mentioned the Chancellor's comments in terms of the Bank of England's rate where it is now. Is it a two-way street from Threadneedle Street to Westminster? Are there signals that could come from the Bank of England that might be helpful or perhaps hindrance to Rachel Reeves as we're counting down to the budget?
Well, Rachel Reeves could be the biggest beneficiary from what the Bank of England does. If the most optimistic forecasts are right and the BOE cuts rates to 3% eventually, she could bank around £10 billion at next year's budget in lower borrowing costs when compared to the 3.8% interest rate floor that's forecast by the Office for Budget Responsibility, the fiscal watchdog, in March. And so she really needs the BOE to cut rates. And that's why I reckon that her speech on Tuesday, yes, was aimed a bit at voters, yes, was aimed a bit at bond markets, but the real target audience was across the road from us, Threadneedle Street, the Bank of England.
Lizzie, thank you so much for being with us. So we look forward to the decision from the Bank of England. That is our UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden.
Now, the US Supreme Court has hinted it's ready to put limits on President Donald Trump's power to impose sweeping global tariffs. The signals came during a 3-hour hearing yesterday, although a ruling isn't expected for several weeks. Let's bring in our Chief Asia correspondent, Rosalind Matheson, for more on this. Ros, what was said then during this hearing, and why is it being interpreted as potentially being bad news for Donald Trump?
Well, as you were saying, the court did appear a bit sceptical, really, of Donald Trump's tariff agenda and his approach to imposing many of these tariffs around the world. And people were passing that for clues as to how they might issue their final ruling, likely before the end of the year. And the feeling that the court is edging towards putting some limits on Donald Trump, that's because you did have, across the divide, scepticism coming in, including from some of the more supportive members of the court, you would say, potentially for Donald Trump's agenda, the more conservative judges. You had the Chief Justice, John Roberts. He called the tariffs an imposition of taxes on Americans. You had a Trump appointee, Amy Coney Barrett. She was asking pretty probing questions, albeit of both sides, but she wasn't holding back. And she was asking how refunds would work if the tariffs were to be invalidating, saying she felt it could be quite a mess. And so you had really some fairly hard questioning coming from both sides of the aisle. It's not surprising to see that coming from the more liberal judges, but to see it from the conservative judges also, just raising again the expectation that perhaps the court in this case, the Supreme Court, might decide to impose some limits on Trump's agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the hearing lasted something like 3 hours. If the court were to rule that Trump has overstepped in terms of his authority in imposing these global tariffs, what would that actually mean?
Well, that's the big question. And really, you know, either way, you're going to see a lot of the uncertainty continue around tariffs and Donald Trump's approach and the reality for companies and countries alike. Because even if the court does go in the direction of imposing some limits, there are other levers, arguably, at Donald Trump's disposal that he can turn towards instead to try and keep the tariff regime going. So there's the question of whether he uses other mechanisms to try and keep tariffs in place, or at least a part of it. There's the question of what do you do if you've already been hit by tariffs and a company paying those? Can you get restitution? Can you essentially get a refund? And it's really not that easy for that to happen. I mean, it's basically paper checks, and the government would have to be inclined to start issuing them. Some of our reporters in the US talked to some company owners who essentially said, we've written this off. You know, this is a sunk cost. We're not going to get this money back either way, even if the court does rule in our favour. So the reality of whether, you know, companies get refunds or others get refunds if the court rules in that direction is very, very unclear. There could be an impact, of course, on countries that are still negotiating trade deals with the US. Do they look at this and say, well, hang on, perhaps the ball is a little bit in our court in the way that we negotiate, or the kinds of things we're willing to agree on as part of it? So there's sort of 3 tiers potentially of impact there, depending on which way the court goes.
We're very interested to see when we do get that ruling which way the justices do decide to lean. Another strand of this trade story, though, we've been talking about the rare earth curbs from China and what that has meant for supplies of these critical minerals. Donald Trump's meeting representatives from 5 Central Asian countries as a global race for natural resources hots up. What should we be expecting from this meeting? And I suppose, how does it fit into efforts that others are making to try and woo mineral-rich countries to secure supplies?
Well, that's right. Everybody's racing for rare earths these days, including the US, and certainly Donald Trump has made it a key part of a lot of his negotiations with countries around the world, including his trade negotiations. What are you willing to give us in terms of rare earths? And he's hosting this summit, as you say, of these 5 countries. It'll be interesting to see it happen at the White House. It gives it that extra level of prestige potentially for these countries and these leaders. But arguably he's doing so also because he's wanting to hear from them what the relationship with the US is going to be, and whether the US can get access to some of the rare earths or the critical minerals that are residing in these countries. But as you say, he's got some competition there, because this is an area that has long been the domain, arguably, of China and Russia, and rivalry between China and Russia in that region. And some of the countries have been concerned since Russia's invasion of Ukraine of being sideswiped by sanctions. So they're not necessarily all in Russia's corner at the moment, but China is a very big presence there also. And even the EU is looking to diversify and open conversations there. So there's quite a bit of competition in this region between all those powers for access to rare earths. And perhaps that's some leverage for these countries in terms of whom or to whom they decide to ship these things to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge question, isn't it? Rare earths. Thank you so much, Ros, for being with us. That is Bloomberg's Chief Asia Correspondent, Roslyn Matheson. Thank you. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
Well, that global race for raw materials, and particularly rare earth minerals, is a key part of the conversation I've been having with the EU's Economy Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis. He joined me in our Brussels studio to talk about a wide range of issues, including the push from the US and Qatar for the EU to water down some of its climate rules. My conversation with Valdis Dombrovskis began with Ukraine and the European Commission's progress on a plan to use frozen Russian assets to support Kyiv.
The European Council tasked the Commission now to work on funding options, so that's what we are currently preparing, but also we have made clear that we see this reparation loan still as a main and most feasible option, so we continue also the technical work on preparation on reparations loan, also engagement with Belgian authorities concerning the guarantees which they need, in a sense, to agree to this reparation loan. But in a sense, this is a proposal which addresses many issues. First of all, there are very sizable funding needs Ukraine is facing. So IMF is putting it at $60 billion for the next 2 years, and that's without military support, which comes in a similar order of magnitude. And also IMF is concerned about debt sustainability in Ukraine, so we cannot just continue with giving loans. Obviously, grants is an option, but the question whether member states would agree to provide grants on that scale. Therefore, this reparation loan, which Ukraine would only need to repay once Russia pays reparation, is a good option because it addresses Ukraine's funding needs. It does not create problems with debt sustainability in Ukraine, and it falls short of confiscation of Russian assets, which, as we know, is so to say, a step too far for a number of member states.
What sort of engagements have you had with Belgium since that meeting, and have you had any indication that they are being reassured by the proposals that the Commission is developing?
We continue working on this. In a sense, it's clear, and this understanding is there also on the Commission side that we need to be serious about those concerns, and we need to find a good way to address them.
Let's turn to some of the other major challenges facing the EU economy as well. The EU's been negotiating with China over access to rare earths after the deal that we saw signed between the US and Beijing to lift export curbs. You said you've seen positive signals from China coming on those measures. What more can you tell us about those signals?
Well, China basically agreed now to suspend those export controls or postpone those export controls by 1 year. So that obviously give us more time for engagement and addressing this issue in a forward-looking way. So there is in a sense, positive short-term developments, but obviously we must keep in mind that we need to work on diversification of our supply chains, because currently, as concerns rare earths, critical minerals, many of those supply chains are 80, 90, more than 90% dominated by China. Therefore, we must work on diversification, because that's how we achieve resilience of supplies. That's why we are accelerating work on our raw materials strategy. So that's why we're engaging in raw materials partnership with a number of countries around the world, and also coordinating this approach with like-minded partners, including in the framework of G7.
So are you satisfied that the supply chain for now is stable while that exemption has been granted? I'm just wondering about the broader risk to the European economy from this. We've had warnings from the likes of Volkswagen, for example, about the impact it could have on their supplies upcoming too.
In a sense, it addresses short-term concerns, but it also shows vulnerability which we are facing in terms of these supplies, and therefore we also must work towards diversification of those supplies.
Where do you look for that?
Actually, I would say, to put simple, around the world, we have already engaged in a raw material partnerships with various countries as diverse from Canada to Uzbekistan and many others. But the issue right now is also to get more practical and more tangible, to start actually developing actual projects on the ground, where the model of partnership we are offering resource-rich countries is that the EU is ready to provide technology, know-how, financing, and also help those countries to increase value added they are getting from their raw materials. So it's not only about extraction, but also developing processing capacities in those countries. So looking for mutually beneficial solutions.
On the question of the corporate due diligence regulations, the CSDDD, which is something that there's a debate ongoing about with the European Parliament, there's been a warning from Qatar's energy minister that if Europe doesn't look at how they can water down or cancel this regulation, they'll stop delivering LNG to Europe. How worried are you about risks like that and the pressure that's being put on these sort of regulations?
Well, as regards CSDD, indeed, there are many businesses both in the EU voicing serious concerns, but also many partners outside the EU. And Qatar is just one example. We have heard from many other countries and businesses on those countries on the concerns. But that's why...
Are you taking them into account?
But that's why CSDD was part of our first omnibus, where we are actually simplifying it quite substantially, including the question on reducing the scope, so which companies will be covered by CSDD, making requirements more proportionate, like obligation to follow only direct business partners, not all the value chains up and down, obligation to do it once per 5 years, not every year, and so on. So there are many tangible improvements and simplifications. What would be now important that the legislative process moves forward, and so simplifications actually become a reality.
But is it a worry that, LNG supplies could be affected by these changes?
In a sense, there are two elements. So one, obviously, as European Union, we retain our regulatory autonomy and our right to regulate businesses which are doing business and are active in Europe. On the other hand, of course, we also need to listen and acknowledge concerns which various partners around the world are having and reflect on the implications.
So that was Valdis Dombrovskis, the EU's Commissioner for Economy and Productivity, and also in charge of simplification, which is part of that effort that we're seeing changes being made, some key EU rules as well, speaking to me in our Brussels studio as well. Look, it's interesting to reflect on that debate that's playing out over EU climate rules as well. The criticism, of course, and this is particularly coming from parliamentarians in the European Parliament, is that the only signs of simplification that people are seeing is in weakening of some of the climate rules. You've had a pushback of the implementation date, for example, on the anti-deforestation rules, debate over the changing of the thresholds of what size of companies would have to report under some of these due diligence regulations as well. So interesting to hear from Valdis Dombrovskis that they are listening and acknowledging the concerns coming from outside of the EU as well, and in particular the comments that we've had from the US and from Qatar.
I thought what was the most interesting was the rare earth element that you discussed with Dombrovskis. I mean, I'm totally fascinated by this. China has become so dominant in this area. There are no rare earth mines anywhere in Europe. It's very difficult to mine these elements. I mean, we call them rare earths. They're actually not that rare. It's just that they're really difficult to mine. There are 17 of them. And China's imposed these controls. Obviously, in recent weeks, they've agreed this 1-year pause with the US. But it is notable that the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's been talking about how the US is going to go at warp speed over the next 1 or 2 years in order to try to break China's hold over the US in this particular area. But, Europe has still, and the UK, I'll include the UK as well, has got this massive challenge because these rare earths are just used in so many things. In iPhones, they're used in cancer treatments, they're used in semiconductors. So I thought, the fact that you talked to Valdis Dombrovskis about rare earths is just another one of these massive challenges that Europe has.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.